You're good.
Good to go. Okay, great. Well, thank you for having me. This is actually the first time I presented just on coho. Most of the times I've given this presentation, it's been primarily a focus on Chinook. Today I've just shortened down some of my earlier presentations to get right to the crux of what we did and what we found. And I understand that there was some desire to consider aspects of the work that might result in either regulation or education. So I thought I'd make that my title. And then we'll kind of work through and I'll give you my opinions on what I think you should regulate and what should be educated. Okay. So I wanted to just give some background into the research so everybody knows where we're coming from with these results. This is kind of our eighth year of doing this work. This is our final year. We've now finished all of our field and lab work in this area. The focus was all on assessing post-release mortality in Chinook and coho. We used acoustic telemetry. We had a broad scale spatial network of underwater receivers managed by numerous groups. All the codes or the colors rather represent the arrays and the management organizations are on the left. Just suffice it to say, there's a lot of receivers out there, and we were able to track fish across many of them. Our study approaches were very careful to try to mimic what we were seeing in recreational fisheries. So we used an experimental approach where we were studying different hook sizes, attractors, terminal tackle, the use of landing nets, water line versus onboard release approaches, and a range of air exposures. We were collecting data on injuries, on scale loss, on bleeding, stock ID, and the physiological condition and infectious agents and potential effects of water temperature as well. So what this meant was we would capture fish as a typical angler, and then the fish would either be brought on the boat in a net, maybe put on the bottom of the boat, as might happen in some instances, or it went right from the water right into the sampling trough, missing the boat and the net, or we may have done everything over the side of the boat, never bringing the fish onto the boat. In all cases, the fish were processed with collecting the information I showed you in the last slide. They were put an acoustic tag on, as you can see in the lower right, and the fish was released. And we tracked its position and its location and its travel rates and related all of these other variables to those factors. Just to give you a sense of some of the things we're looking at, we were looking at bleeding, and so it's different scales of bleeding from minor to severe. And just to point out that the bleeding often was associated with the mouth where the hook penetrated. Sometimes it was a minor bleed, it was something more moderate. And then in this case, very severe. I want to point out that severe bleeding often happened often with my brain's going blank here.
Treble
Um,
hooks?
Thank you.
I
With
know you
treble
know that.
hooks. That's what I was trying to say. And you can kind of see where the treble is piercing various parts of the mouth, and then the water we're holding it in ends up looking like Kool-Aid. We'll come back to the treble hook issue later on. I know that's a concern of your group. We also looked at eye injuries. Eye injuries were generally occurred as a result of single hooks penetrating through the mouth into the ocular socket. And so you may have a minor injury, more major, or in some cases, the entire eye was lost. And again, this is happening from basically a large hook going into a small mouth and penetrating through the roof of the mouth into the eye. Scale loss was something that's really important, and we measured that, in terms of either being minor, moderate, or severe. Scale loss occurred as a result of several factors, including our handling. The nets were particularly bad. These are all fish-friendly nets. And anytime the fish touched our hands or touched the boat. Fin fraying was something else we were really interested in, and we can see some minor fraying, some more moderate, or some real severe. Lots of different ways fins can fray, but as I'll show you later, mostly it was caused by nets. So we did this study in two different ways for both coho and Chinook. I'm just going to talk about the coho results today. And so our coho study for our release, our tracking in the wild occurred largely out of Port Renfrew, where fish were tagged in this green area. And then we were focusing on eastward moving coho stocks, so ones that we knew were going to head this direction and cross this array. And some of them were also going down to Puget Sound. Some were probably going to the Fraser. We categorized those fish in real coarse categories into whether they were in good, moderate, or poor condition. I just want to point out that in all cases, there was some amount of scale loss, minor, moderate to severe, no bleeding, a little bit of bleeding, a lot of bleeding, and so on. So we categorize these fish in this fashion, and I'll just show you some of the results to go for this 3-day migration. And so to get to that yellow line, on average, the mortality was about 17% if you were in good condition under these variables. Moderate condition, mortality is about twice as high. Poor condition was higher still. Now, to travel to Puget Sound for those stocks, we also did the same thing. It's about a 5 to 9 day travel to get there. We found about 40% mortality in good condition fish to get there, and about 70 to 80% in moderate and poor condition fish. There was no difference between those categories. And so what it's telling us is that, there's some significant amounts of mortality going on, particularly in those first few days of travel, even if the fish is in relatively good condition, although I will come back to the scale loss issue on number one here shortly. So this is kind of the first estimates that we have for sort of short and medium term post-release mortality with coho out of a typical recreational angler fishery. We also continued this work and just finished it this year in using holding studies. So holding studies allow us to look more in depth into the mechanisms, both physiological and injury based, that may be causing some of these shorter term mortality events. So we focused out in Barkley Sound here and worked out of the Bamfield Marine Science Center. That's what we're looking at on the right. And so they built us these beautiful large tanks where we were able to hold fish. And so the study design was that we'd capture fish, we'd do an immediate assessment on them and transport them back to the Bamfield lab. It took about 4 days to load up all the tanks for a given trial. We'd hold these fish for about 10 days and we'd be observing changes in their physiology and their appearance and their survival. And then at the end of it all, they were sacrificed and we did some biological sampling. So we have this overall 14-day experiment, which is nice because it certainly contains that 3 to 5 day window that we were also studying in our release mortality tracking component. So there's a couple different treatments we focused on in this holding study. The first was whether you used a net or something called the sling. So this is a typical fish-friendly net and a typical coho encounter. I want you to watch how that coho rolls. And this is a behavior that we found with coho. Maybe some of you have seen this. That's a little different than Chinook. And so when the coho get into a net, they start to roll. Probably some sort of defensive approach they have to get the hook off of them, but they're rolling. The other way we tried to use fish to get fish on the boat without encountering net was with what we call a sling. Obviously, this is not practical for recreational fishery, but we wanted to try to minimize any of the negative effects of that net. And so the sling was good at some level, but the fish, again, likes to roll around the line when it gets into that device. So it wasn't as good as we were hoping, but I'll come back to that in a minute. We also studied hook numbers. So we had single hook setups and tandem hook setups. We didn't directly use treble hooks, but the tandem hook as 2 hooks will give us a bit of an analogy of what might happen with a treble. And so, as I mentioned, the coho like to roll, and when they roll, they start wrapping the lines around themselves. So you can see immediately scale loss when they roll a little bit. When they start rolling a lot, there's more scale loss. You can actually see the line right there where the fish rolled over on the line, either before we got on the boat or as it's going into the net. So these line wrap wounds are important, and I'm going to come back to talk about this. This is something we didn't really see in Chinook. So to get around the scale loss issues that we had, we developed something we called the Ning. It was a cross between a net and a sling. If you have a better name, we'd like to hear it. Anyway, basically what it is a fish-friendly net, but at the bottom we've got a material that we used in the sling with some openings for water to get out. So there's no way for the fish to lose scales as a result of getting captured in there. And so you can see the fish comes out pretty easily. They're not touching the netting material, then they get put right in the trough so we can do the assessment and release them. And they went into there often with no scale loss whatsoever. So we do have sort of a control with no scale loss, which is going to be important, as you'll see. Um, so we created this variable called dermal wounding. In other words, if a fish was in a net, there's going to be wounding. If it hit the deck, fish are slippery. Sometimes they hit the deck. Then it's wounded dermally. Or if we saw line wrapping around it when it came on to the boat, all of these things we classified as dermal wounding. And you can see a distinct difference between fish that had no dermal wounds and those that did. And so those that didn't had perfect survival over the 2 week period. Whereas those that had some element of dermal wounding, we saw, up to 20, 25% mortality of those fish. Changing gears a little bit, talking about fins and fin damage. So we would count the number of fins that were damaged on a given fish. We found that fin damage was primarily caused by fish-friendly landing nets. And you can see how this happens. Even though this is a nice material, the fins bifurcate really easily, and they actually you can see, ended up right inside each of these little plastic lines of the net. And so even though landing nets are fish-friendly in some regards, in other ways they aren't. And so just keeping that in mind, when we start looking at the relationship between number of damaged fins and survival, it's a pretty strong relationship. So here we are, number of fins damaged, none, and you had almost perfect survival of those fish through the 14 days. On the other hand, if we go down here to 4 to 7 fins damaged, you start seeing a highly significant difference between survival of that and the 0 fin damage. And we're down here now to about 30% mortality. So small things like the line or the net taking scales off or numbers of fins being damaged is a really big factor, or big factors in terms of the survival of these fish, at least in the short to medium term. Just changing gears to get to hooks now. So we've got single hooks or tandem hooks, and the big and we're comparing minor hooking wounds, moderate hooking wounds, or severe. The big difference with the tandem hookups was that we had many more severe hooking wounds than we did with single hookups. So twice, you had two times the hook. We had twice the number of severe injuries. And it wasn't just the severity of the injury that was the problem. It comes down to how easy it is for somebody to remove a hook when you've got two hooks involved. And so the single hook, we came up with a score of ease of taking it off. So if a single hook, you can see up here, you can quickly pull that hook off either with a tool or a gaff. It pops right out. However, if there's a double hook and there's another hook embedded in the mouth, you can't use this tool to pull it out. And so we found a fairly large number of fish it was really hard to get the hook out. You can see down here in the mouth, one of the hooks is wedged down deep where the other one was in the lip. The other problem we have is when you're trying to release a fish and it's in a net and it's got a double hook setup. One time the hook sometimes gets wrapped in the net if the other hook is in the mouth. So that becomes a real challenge then to get the fish quickly out of the net. So the tandem hookups were definitely not desirable if you're trying to release fish without injury and quickly. Now, I know there's interest in treble versus single. We didn't look at this directly with coho, but we did with Chinook. So I thought I'd show you those results. So these are again from a holding study, identical design, but with Chinook. And we have survival probability on this axis, size of the fish on this axis. The orange is single. The treble hooks are green. And you can see that By any fish that's less than about 60 centimeters, we start seeing these differences with the treble hook having really high mortality, low survival up until about a 60 centimeter Chinook. So this is the zone down here when people are releasing Chinook, either legal ones they have to release or ones that are smaller than legal and they have to release them for those reasons. And you can see a fairly big difference. And the smaller the fish, the poorer the survival when you have a treble hook. I can't imagine it would be any different for coho. So more severe injuries and bleeding with the treble hook, poor survival of smaller fish. Just coming back to this figure I showed you earlier, I just wanted to remind us that, we're tagging fish, we're tracking them for about 3 days to get to this line. We had good, moderate, and poor condition, but I'm going to focus now on the scale loss issue, minor, moderate to severe, and put up the numbers in a graph form instead of just listing them as text. And so why I'm doing this is because, you'd think that good condition fish should have much lower survival than this. Well, I have to point out that there was some scale loss, even with good condition fish. And it wasn't, in fact, there was no real difference between the good and the moderate condition. It was the ones that were really poor shape that also had probably eye injuries or more bleeding that survived even more poorly. But the takeaway is that all of the fish in this study were netted. Okay, all of them came on with a fish-friendly landing net. So it's not a surprise that even good condition fish had some scale loss. And when we looked at the holding study, any dermal wounding of fish had very similar mortality rates of about 20%, 25% to what we see in the good condition fish that we had that were telemetry tracked. So there's a convergence of these findings between the holding study and the telemetry tracking, and it seems to come down to this dermal injury aspect for coho in terms of having really decent survival with no dermal injury or at least 20% mortality, 80% survival with some level, even minor level of dermal injury. So the implications, any interaction with the dermal layer of coho is going to reduce their survival. I know I recognize this as a Chinook, but it's a great picture of a tagged fish, so I wanted to show it. And Quinn is the grad student who did all the coho work, so I wanted to show him too. The good news is that small changes to angler behavior, in other words, doing waterline releases, and gear choice, like small single hooks, can greatly increase the survival of fish after release. I just dug into one of your files that you sent me, and I'm noticing on figure 6A that half of your captured fish are released. So of those half, how many survived? Well, I'm going to assume everybody used a net, and I'm going to suspect that there was some line wrapping involved and some scale loss. So my guess is, 30 to 40% probably of your fish died of those ones that were released. We don't know for sure, but it certainly wasn't 0%. There's going to be some noticeable amount, probably definitely double digit and probably of the order of 30% or so. However, it is possible to get that down significantly with some best practices. Now, just to get into the education aspect, we also did a survey of anglers while we were doing our research, and we wanted their opinions on releasing fish as a conservation and management tool. I'm going to give you the takeaways. I'm going to show you two main findings that I think you'll find both interesting and maybe disturbing. The general takeaways is that, all anglers we talked to were open to new information on best practices. They were all open to that. They were all supportive of creating educational resources because there's very few out there. Some were already using the best practices that we recommended. But here's some of the responses. Of an important question is, if your intention is to harvest a salmon, you caught one that you could legally keep, would anything influence you to release it rather than keep it? And this is a particularly important question for those that fish for coho. 40% of people said no, they keep all legal salmon and cease fishing when quota is reached. And that's a good answer and what I think we would want to hear. However, when we look at the rest of the people, they were all in favor of releasing, and over a third of the people said they'd release a large legal fish because they felt that would be important in terms of genetics, and they said fecundity and all that kind of stuff, which is true. However, we know the largest fish are the ones that are going to probably survive the best of all the size classes. The most troubling is that About a third would also release small legal fish. If it's barely legal, I may throw it back, hoping to get a bigger one. Sometimes if it's a bigger one that I could get legally, I may more like to throw it back and keep a smaller one. So there's a lot of decision making going on with anglers, and but there's certainly a significant number of them that will fish and release fish until they get a better option. And I think that this is the problem with coho fisheries. There's a lot of people fishing and landing maybe 20 coho and keeping only two. And I think that's where you really need to be looking at education. So the final point that we asked people is, where did you learn your best practices? And almost all said self-learned. I don't know. It was common sense. It's my own judgment. You know, if you stick your head in a bucket of water, you can't breathe for 5 minutes. How well are you going to do? It makes sense to me. So self-learned is where most people are getting their information. The other portions, and by the way, this can add up to over 100% a little bit, was by friends and guides. And then almost nobody was able to find resources online or from other sources. Even this avid online angler said, you know, he sees a few things, but he says there's a gap. And I think there's a huge gap. You can't find this, at least up until the work we were doing, you couldn't find any information on best practices. That's changed now. Now there are lots of resources. I'll point you to them in a moment. But I think this is a huge gap that we had in the angling community. So the best practice recommendations that we came up with to minimize release mortality for coho and chinook kind of break down into 5 groups, and a couple of which I think are really important for coho. Gear choice, you know, large hooks should be avoided, treble hooks should be avoided, multi-hook setup should be avoided, and inline flashers, mostly because they make the fish work even harder if they're in line to land. And there were some issues with recovery we found, particularly with chinook. Landing approaches, land quickly, avoid air, and the big one, avoid using nets. Handling approaches, limit touching with your hands. Release approaches, the big one, do it at the water line. Use a gaff or a tool. Don't revive your fish because you're probably handling your fish. And location decisions, and these are also important. You know, avoid areas where you get into small fish. If you see this, leave because you're going to release the small fish legally, and the chances of them surviving are minimal. And the big one is stop fishing once your quota is attained, as a few individuals in our survey said they would do. So where do you find some of these best practices? Well, in terms of the science, if you're interested, you can find the science at this website here. It's a report that I wrote. It's slowly coming out in the literature. Here's an example of some of it coming out in the literature already. And this paper actually examines release mortality in all fisheries in salmon, not just angling, but also all the commercial gear. So if you're interested in commercial release of coho, I would suggest you take a look at this paper. There are several online educational resources, including videos that I think are really important for anglers to see. So this link takes you to the Sport Fishing Institute of BC, where there's a lot of resources. This is a video they made. It's a 1 minute long video that basically summarizes everything I've said here. They also have videos on there showing you how to do a gaff release. And then if you want written documents in terms of the results that we came up with, but pared down into sort of executive summaries, you can find that in the Pacific Salmon Foundation website at this link. So back to the question that you wanted me to consider, regulation versus education. What is the balance? And my recommendation would be that gear restrictions should be regulated. For example, no use of treble hooks and small gap width on single hooks. And to show you that this is something that DFO is serious about, they just recently told the SFAC meeting they had in Nanaimo that they're going to be implementing a single barbless, no trebles allowed, 15 mm gap width in all MSF and non-retention fisheries, and that's coming soon. So if you were to push for gear restrictions, you would have DFO's ear because they're already starting to do that. On the other hand, I think angling behavior needs to be educated. And this is where they need to be doing boat side releases and stop fishing once your quota is obtained. And I think this is where the educational resources and powerful messaging that can come out from your group and others would be really helpful. I don't think it's possible to easily regulate these things. That's why I'm saying it should be education, whereas some of these gear restrictions can be easily regulated. And it's not an added expense to anglers to do these regulations. It's really small. Okay, I think that's everything, Megan.
That was so awesome. Thank you, Scott.
You're welcome.
Fantastic. Okay, I'm gonna open the floor.
I explained things so well.
I
There are,
mean,
there are
it was
no
pretty
questions.
good. Yeah, thank you for the links. As you probably heard when you logged in, we are recording this talk because there's a concurrent talk happening and some of our folks can't be here today. So are you okay with us
Oh,
sharing?
yeah,
Okay.
sure.
Ken, I see your hand.
Yeah, you mentioned some commercial fish release mortality statistics. I'm just wondering how they compare to rec, without reading the
They're,
paper.
they're actually in the same ballpark to our telemetry work where we were netting the fish out into the boat before we tagged them. So it was on the order of 30% mortality. And of course, in that situation, they were it was purse seines that we were studying.
Okay.
So, and with purse seine fisheries, the big issues that we found was the density of the fish in the nets, the higher densities, and when they were close to the boat, they started getting more wounded. And there was probably also asphyxiation issues. We weren't necessarily measuring, but you could kind of see that happening. And so in that paper, we talk about how purse seines and gill nets, if we use some of the typical practices that we've been using, you can have 30, 40% or higher post-release mortality. However, it can be much lower if we're not bunching the net close to the boat, and if we're brailing with smaller numbers of fish and we're touching them with our hands less. So you're never going to get down to the zero like we see, like you can do with angling if you don't bring it on the boat, because there's going to be some net interaction probably at some level. But it can probably be reduced with some lighter touching and better, net management.
And did you look at Gillnet? Because I know they
Yeah.
had the coho recovery boxes on there. What any kind of thoughts
Yeah,
on
so the coho recovery boxes are great if the major problem is metabolic. In other words, the fish have been swum so hard that they are into anaerobiosis and they can no longer continue swimming. The recovery boxes do nothing for fish that are injured. The injuries don't heal. We've also looked at this over time. If these fish are maturing or they're in their last year of life, they're going to be carrying those line marks, those scale loss, and those torn fins for the rest of their life. And we actually studied that to see, and indeed, we found fish that we had tagged in the ocean that had those injuries, and we found them on spawning grounds. They still had those injuries. So the injuries aren't going away, but the recovery boxes work if the fish are swum so hard that they can't be released immediately. So I would think that if we were looking on a troll fishery where you might have a recovery box, if assuming that you don't have an eye injury caused by the large hooks they use, and again, if you have an eye injury, a recovery box isn't going to help you. So the recovery box is really pointed at one of the issues, but it doesn't deal with some of the other bigger ones.
Okay, super helpful.
Well, we'll keep you posted, Scott. We're actively pursuing both education and regulation right now with our DFO counterparts. So this has been really helpful, and I appreciate you retooling your talk for a coho focus.
It's about time. Coho always gets the short shaft, I think, always do compared to Chinook. So I'm happy to see Coho get their due.
Right on. Sweet. Um, okay, well, thank
Okay.
you. Thanks so much. And maybe if you can put your email in the chat, Scott, then
Yeah,
people
I'll do
can
that right
follow
now.
up.
You're right. I should have put it on the top of my talk. I forgot. Yeah, I'll put it in the chat right now.
It's all good. And then, yeah, if you want to email me your slides, that would be great.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to stop the recording now, and we'll say thank you and goodbye to the DFO folks if they're still on the line.